journals. So it's a big drop-down list. Here's that screenshot of Think Check Submit that I mentioned was coming up, and you can see an example of the checklist that you'll be provided with for you to evaluate your journals. So these are the kinds of questions I've sort of already mentioned. Do you and your colleagues know the journal? Have you read any articles in the journal before? Is it easy to discover the latest papers in the journal? Can you easily identify and find contact information for the journal's publisher? Is the journal transparent about the kind of peer review it uses? And this final question down the bottom, do the editorial board mention the journal on their own websites? And it comes back to that comment I made earlier about predatory journals basically making up a list of impressive sounding researchers for their editorial board. We do have editors contacting us saying, I've heard that I'm on a list for this journal. I'm absolutely not. How can I get my name off of that journal's list? It's a really complex minefield for our legal team. So here's a screenshot of Wiley Online Libraries platform. So this is one of our journals, Agriculture and Resource Economics, just so I can basically talk you through where to find some of this information that I've been talking about. So all of our journals essentially look the same. There is some, we do have the capacity to add in additional information, news, announcements, videos, etc. But you're basically looking at the template for our journals. In the About drop-down menu is where you'll find the overview, the journal's aims and scopes, the list of the editorial board, and contact information for the editorial office and production, if necessary, as well. In the drop-down menu you can see, which is Contribute, is the author guidelines. So that's the journal telling you how to put together your manuscript and the type of manuscripts that they publish as well. So how to format your tables, your figures, what sort of referencing style they use. All of that information is in author guidelines as well as their policies. Information on open access is currently crossed out by the top of that red circle, but that's open access information, and that's a link to actually all of our open access pricing. We've basically got it looks really simple, but it's really effective. All of our journals are in an Excel sheet that you can download. It's updated annually as the prices change, but it'll include the article publication charges in US dollars, in pounds, in euros. Maybe it's just the three. I feel like there might be a fourth, but I can't think of what it is. So you can look up any journal and you access it through that option that you currently can't see behind the red line. Where it's circled and highlighted in blue, Submit a Manuscript, is where you go to submit your manuscript. You can also click on Submit an Article on the right, and that will take you to the journal's personalised link to our Manuscript Central platform. You'll create an author account, and you'll go through the steps of uploading your paper and answer any of the necessary journal-specific questions that the editor might have requested, like what is your ORCID ID, like have you undertaken any ethics applications, and what the reference numbers, etc. for those might be. Because I'm not in the editorial office, I don't have access to Manuscript Central, so I can't show you a shot of what that actually looks like, but you're basically walked through step by step, and you can get in contact with the editorial office if you do have any questions. So coming to ORCID again, here's a little bit more information of why it's of value to really consider creating one. So a lot of our journals are requiring authors to have an ORCID prior to submission. So at the very least, to submit to a Wiley journal, you're going to need one. We're not the only publisher introducing those kinds of policies. Wiley is on the executive board of ORCID, and so are a number of other publishers. And we also run marketing campaigns to try to encourage you to do that. But as I said, it's basically around creating a unique digital identifier that is specific to you as a researcher. And it can be really handy if, for example, you have a common name, for instance. You may even be working on the same paper with that person as the same name, who has the same name as yours. And so how can other researchers and search engines differentiate and make sure and ensure correctly that your research is being attributed to you? It's also an easy thing to include on grant and funding applications, because all you need as your identifier is that short code. And it's not going to change. As I said, it stays with you, and you can use it across a variety of publishing and scholarly collaboration networks that will just bring your research together in a nice, neat way. So basically, the point we're at now is you've written your paper, you've found the journal that you want to submit to, and you've submitted it online through Manuscript Central or whatever submissions platform the journal happens to use. Most of ours do use Manuscript Central. So what happens next? Your paper is going to go through peer review. And one of the first things I like to highlight about peer review is that it's a conversation. And I think that's worth mentioning, because I think peer review, or the process of having your work reviewed and critiqued by experts, by peers in your field, can be really intimidating, especially when you do receive that quite intense looking reviewer report, which you will receive. So I think it's worth highlighting that it's a conversation, that you have the right, you're well within your rights, and we would encourage you to ask any questions, to ask for further clarification on any comments that the reviewers may have had, and that you don't, and for you to not feel like it's just someone who you don't even know the identity of is basically just dictating to you how your paper needs to look for publication. You do have the capacity to ask some questions. So when we're talking about peer review, this is the process of screening a submitted manuscript. The manuscript will be reviewed by professionals in the same field before it's published in a journal. The process is designed to assess the validity, the quality, and often the originality of articles for publication, and its ultimate purpose is to maintain the integrity of science, and it does this by filtering out invalid or poor quality articles. Now, there's a couple of different ways that peer review operates. If you are based in the sciences, you'll be most likely familiar with single blind review, and this is where the authors do not know who the reviewers are, but the reviewers are able to access the names of the authors. In the humanities and social sciences, we most often see double blind, and this is where, as the name suggests, reviewers don't know the names of the authors and the authors don't know the names of the reviewers. I mentioned open peer review again back when I first talked about open science. Now, there's only a small number of journals operating with open peer review, which the principle behind this is that kind of everyone knows the identity of everyone. As a reviewer, you know the author. As an author, you know who the reviewer is. But it's a growing minority of journals, so it is worth mentioning. And as we move towards open practices in publishing more broadly, I think we will see more and more journals adopting this open peer review. As strange as it may seem, because we're so used to the closedness and I guess the safety of single or double blind peer review. Some of the concerns around open peer review, you may be able to guess, is the potential for bias or the potential for conflicts among researchers to potentially impact on the way a paper may be reviewed. But I guess the ultimate response from proponents of open peer review is relying on the professionalism of academics and knowing that whatever may be happening outside of this particular paper isn't going to stop good, sound science from being published. So there's a few things that reviewers are looking for when they're assessing a paper and putting together their report. They're looking for a hypothesis. So what question does this paper answer? Can they easily identify it, and can they clearly identify an answer to the question as well? Innovation, coming back to that idea of putting forward something original and something significant. What is it about your paper that's unique, that's saying something new? Being a research paper, it obviously needs evidence. The conclusions that you've reached in your paper supported by good, sound science and data. they're looking at your writing as well. Are the results clear and understandable? It can be difficult with scientific writing to get caught up in jargon, but I think remembering that the best writing is the clearest writing is a good way to think about it. Context as well. Are your results produced within the context of other well-credited research? And ethics. Are there any guidelines your paper needed to adhere to? And were all of those boxes ticked? So treat this as a discussion. Try not to take it personally when you receive the reviewer report. Remember that everyone is human. And I think part of that is why I couldn't say with any certainty that this would receive a different outcome, but you do also have the capacity to reject a reviewer report that suggests your paper shouldn't be published. So I'll basically explain the kinds of reports you might receive. One is that the reviewers have ultimately suggested that your paper doesn't get published. Now, they're not the final decision makers, the editor-in-chief are, but the editor-in-chief do rely on reviewers and their feedback. That's important to them. So if the reviewers say your paper, they don't recommend your paper be published, there's a good chance it won't be. You have the capacity to respond and question in a very scientifically sound and clear way why you think that decision was incorrect. As I said, kind of a slim chance it will make a difference, but you can at least respond if you feel the reviewers perhaps fundamentally misunderstood the central argument of your paper, for instance. You do need to make sure, as I said, that everything is backed up by science, that it's not an emotional response, and that's why we would recommend responding to any reviewer report after a couple of days when you sort of settle down, just so you can remain completely objective. The other kind of report you'll receive is recommended revisions. And so these will be comments, questions, perhaps gaps in your research that the reviewers have identified that they've suggested you fix in order for the editor to consider publishing your paper. Now again, what you'll be expected to do here is to work your way quite methodically through the report and show in the report and in your paper how you've addressed each of the comments or questions. Again, you don't need to necessarily make every change that's been suggested, but there's a couple of things to remember here, and one is that these reviewers are experts in your field, and if they have a comment or a question or a concern about your paper, there's a good chance that other researchers in your area will, and best that those comments, concerns, questions are all addressed prior to the paper being published. So do keep that in mind. If you decide not to move forward with the publication, you perhaps don't have time to make all the required changes, that's fine. You can let the editor-in-chief know. I did that myself once when I just didn't have the time, and because of that transparency, there's no hard feelings around that. But you do want to take that reviewer report and consider still making the changes to your paper before you send it out to another publication. I was talking to an editor the other day, and he told me he'd received the same paper 3 times as a peer reviewer. He works for a few different journals, and each time he saw that paper, the following 2 times, the author had not made any changes. They'd completely disregarded all of his reviewer comments, and so his ultimate response this 3rd time was just no, was just to reject the paper, because the author clearly hadn't bothered to pay any attention or didn't think the reviewer reports were valuable, and it was being sent to the same people to review. So that can be, at the very least, a little bit embarrassing, I think. Okay, so now we've been through peer review, you've survived, you've worked your way through the reviewer report, you've made all of those changes, the editor-in-chief has given it the thumbs up, and so the next step your paper moves to is production and copyright. So once your paper's been accepted, it'll be sent off to the journal's production editor. The production editor is going to make sure your paper adheres to the correct journal style, whatever that may be, that it follows the journal's correct conventions for layout, around name, presentation, abbreviations, etc. You'll get your proofs back following that, and this is your final opportunity to make sure that everything is correct, that this has unfortunately happened once, but that your name, the spelling of your name hasn't been changed, that all of your tables have all of the data that you want them to, etc. So do have a thorough look through and make sure that you adhere to any deadlines that the production editor has given you for making these changes as well. You don't want to risk holding up the publication of an issue because you haven't responded to your proof questions in adequate time. Obviously stuff does come up and that's fine, but just be open about that so the production office know and they can make the necessary changes to their schedule as well. So if we're looking at publication and frequency for a journal, this will change for each. Generally, a journal will publish from anywhere from 3 to 24 issues a year. This information will be on the journal's homepage. As I said, you can get in touch with editorial or production for turnaround times. This is also the part of the timeline when you'll be asked to sign your copyright transfer agreement. So this is if you're publishing in a subscription or hybrid journal, this is the standard copyright agreement that you will sign. I won't get into the specifics of it, but if you go on Wiley Author Services, it'll give you a nice overview of what your rights actually are. If you're publishing your paper as open access, it'll be a Creative Commons license that you're signing, and this is the stage where you'll be required to pay that article publication charge as well. So I said I'm not going to get into the specific technical language of a copyright transfer agreement, but what I do want to give you is some information on what you can do with your paper, because that's included in the license, but in arguably confusing legal jargon. And so this website, how can I share it? And also this information from this table on Wiley Author Services